There you go. And so, Mac, your job is to figure out the hornbill in a second. But let me welcome our speaker today. It's a pleasure to have Daniela Miteva here at the Mitchell Center. I was telling her that it's a good place to be. I'm not sure everyone would call Lynn Ostrom an economist, but she got the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences a few years ago and was here to give a talk at that time. Daniela is a really interesting environmental economist with a fascinating background. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit about the background first and then tell you what she's doing now. So she was at Bryn Mawr, not far from where I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and did her bachelor's degree in both economics and biology. She even did interesting research on pollination ecology. I almost went into that field at one point as a postdoc, but veered off in another direction. Went on to the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke, where she did her PhD in environmental and resource economics and development economics. For the last 3 years, she's been a postdoctoral researcher with the Nature Conservancy, which is a really interesting, we talk about boundary work, spanning boundaries between basically like research and practice or theory and practice. This is definitely the world in which Daniela's been working the last few years with some amazing colleagues. She even ended up in different places while doing that work at Colorado State, Fort Collins, then at the University of Minnesota, and currently at TNC's headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. She has recently accepted a new position as an assistant professor of sustainable development and economy in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics at The Ohio State University. So that's a really good group. In fact, one of the really bright stars there is a professor named Alina Irwin, who was in this room a few years back helping us get some of our sustainability research off the ground. So I know she'll be working with wonderful colleagues there. We invited, especially, by the way, this is co-sponsored by the School of Forest Resources, and a lot of the folks in the room know more about all of these issues than I do. But we invited Daniela here because there's been a lot of interest in understanding how forest certification works. You may know that Maine is one of the leading states in the country in terms of the percent of its forests that are certified, which in a way is a kind of, I think you can view it as an experiment in how well we can manage forests for environmental, social, and economic goals. But as near as we can tell, and I think Danielle has a really powerful story about this, there's a lot more to be done to really evaluate the effectiveness of certification programs. And so we're interested in figuring out how to do that and when I say we, I mostly mean Aaron and Mindy and Aaron Simons-Ligard and Casey and John Daigle, folks like that, but trying to figure out how to evaluate the effectiveness of certification, maybe a little bit more in the temperate zone. This will be about the tropics, right here in our backyard, and hopefully have that be a model for other regions. So we quickly came across the great work that Daniela's been doing for a number of years. Her interest and expertise are pretty broad, looking at interactions between economic activities and the natural environment, certainly about biodiversity per se in the developing world, quantifying ecosystem services, quantifying the impacts of policy interventions like certification, and looking at trade-offs between environmental, social, and economic goals. So I think we're in for a great talk today. Welcome, Daniela.
Hello, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for coming. So this is joint work I did with Kobe Lux at WWF and Sabrando Patanayak at Duke University. So the big overarching question behind this work is, how do we know whether something's working? And in this case, we use forest management certification, especially FSC certification, which stands for Forest Sustainability Council certification. This is third-party certification that has three goals: environmental appropriateness, socially beneficial outcomes, and economically viable outcomes. So it's been a while. It's been there for a while, but we don't really know whether it's been working. So this is one of the first papers that actually quantified what the impacts on the ground are. Indonesia has had this certification scheme since, I think, most of the companies certified around 2006, and since 2000, and we used data up to 2008 to evaluate it worked.
where things
I don't know
go.
what I did, but so this is. All right. So, okay, so just wanted to give you a quick overview of where deforestation is happening. So the red colors here are deforestation. Forest degradation is this horrible brownish color, and then the green is forest. So the take-home message from this map is there's a lot of deforestation happening in tropical areas. And these are the areas where, first of all, they have tons of biodiversity. They are super important for climate change mitigation, and they have very high poverty levels. So the question is, how do we protect biodiversity, decrease poverty, and contribute to climate change mitigation in these areas that are so challenging? Right? So FSC certification is one of those schemes. So it's voluntary incentive-based scheme that's supposed to introduce better forest management practices. And the question is it working? All right. So forest certification, the idea has been around for a while. So in the mid-90s, there were different certification schemes that came into being. So there were, so these are two of the big ones. FSC was introduced because WWF and other NGOs partnered together to propose a new way to stop tropical deforestation, whereas PEFC was promoted by industry. So that because of the different origins, they have different requirements. And then this is a third certification scheme to show that there are some local ones as well. So this is a certification scheme in Indonesia. I don't know what it stands for, but it's less stringent than FSC. Right. So there are these two certification schemes, and we don't really know whether or not they're working. So that's a big take-home message that I'm hoping people take. So FSC has three goals. So today I'm going to spend my time talking about FSC certification and trying to figure out how do we quantify the impacts of FSC certification and start thinking about what are some ways in which we can improve whether or not FSC's impacts on the ground. So FSC has three goals, and while the standards vary country by country, there are three big things that FSC tries to do. So these are to achieve socially beneficial, environmentally appropriate, and economically viable outcomes. Right? So what this means is, for environmental appropriateness, they have requirements to do with fire management, the creation of buffer zones, the conservation of these high conservation value forests that are very important for biodiversity, and reduced impact logging practices. So socially beneficial practices, they have two main streams. One of them is resolving land tenure conflicts with different stakeholders. So making sure in order for concessions to get certified, they have to resolve all the different claims that multiple groups have to the land. And then other channels through which the socially beneficial outcomes are happening are through the payment of higher wages, job security, also the creation of education centers and healthcare centers. So in other words, in a community, a concessionaire provides these benefits to the local people. Right? And then sometimes in Indonesia, they provide community development funds, and these can be used to improve literacy within the village. Okay. And in this paper, we're not looking at the economic side. So the literature has suggested there are three reasons why a company may want to certify. One of them is brand differentiation. In other words, people associate the company name with good practices, so consumers seek out that brand, right? And you build brand loyalty. Access to markets, and that's a big deal, especially with the new legislation that got introduced in Europe and the Lacy Act in the US. In other words, companies cannot import timber that was not certified. Right? So in other words, if you don't certify, you can't operate in Europe or the US. And then people have suggested that there may be a price premium. In other words, timber may be traded at slightly higher prices if it's certified. And the idea is that the higher prices would offset some of the costs that companies incur. All right, so I'm not going to talk about this. We don't really have data. And the literature is a little bit mixed whether or not this is actually happening. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is what happens when you want to certify a company. So before certification, there are different processes that need to take place. One of them is the on-site assessment, which is has two parts. One of them is just inventorying the forest and taking care or recording the state of the forest and the type of practices that concessionaires use. The second one is meeting with stakeholders and recording all kinds of conflicts or all kinds of issues that different stakeholders raise. Right? So if somebody has claims to the land or is afraid that the concessionaire is harvesting too many of their culturally important species, this is when they'll bring it up. And in order for certification to happen, all these conflicts have to be resolved. There were technical assistant groups like the Tropical Forest Foundation who help concessionaires adopt better practices. Right? And then once you meet these requirements, you get certification. And then every year the concession gets audited. And then if it does not comply with the certification standards, it gets issued a corrective action request, and the concessionaire gets 30 days or 60 days, depending on the severity of the violation, to fix it. And if they don't fix it, the certificate is either suspended or terminated. And then all the public report, all the audit findings are public, so you can go to the Rainforest Alliance website and download all these reports. Right. All right. I work on a Mac, so I apologize for the weird stuff that's showing up. So all this graph is intended to do is show you what's happening through time. So this is the areas of certified under FSC, right? And that's in millions of hectares with exclamation points. Look at those. Right? And then this is the year. Also exclamation. Anyway, so the idea here is that through time we see an increase of the area that gets certified under FSC. So the question is, it's been around for a while. First concession shows up as being certified in 1997. And through 2012, there are tons of forest hectares that have been certified. The question is it working? All right, so this is the spatial distribution of these forest hectares. So the darker green shows the more area production forest under FSC certification. So what you can see here is that there is a lot of the really heavily certified forests are in Europe. And then Uruguay, but that's a weird case study because they have plantations that are eucalyptus plantations, which are non-native and they're certified under FSC, but that's a different story. So in this talk, we're going to look at native forests and whether FSC has had an impact on native forests. And you can see that the tropic, there is some FSC certification in the tropics, don't see really that much. All right, so the big question, is FSC doing anything? And the short answer is currently we don't really know. So these are the handful of studies that look at whether or not FSC has had an impact on the forest loss. So most of these studies are based on a few countries. So these are important countries, sometimes pieces of countries. But it's only 5 countries, right? It's given the number of countries that have forest certification. There's a lot more work currently underway. So that's the good news, and hopefully next year we can revisit this slide. But for now, there is mixed evidence whether or not it's working. It's working in Chile, for example, whereas in Mexico we don't really have any impact. Same in Cameroon and Peru. So it's working somewhere, but not in other places. And so the big question is, why is it working there? And that's something to consider. So in terms of forest degradation, so that was before the previous slide was deforestation, now it's forest degradation. Again, the evidence is limited to a table. And there were the studies that have looked at forest degradation as the outcome have considered different proxies for degradation. So people have looked at felling, the skidding, hauling, and types of emissions. People have looked at biomass, logging intensity, or like garbage disposal. So there is some evidence that FSC is improving practices on the ground. But again, this comes from very few locations. All right, and then this is the only study that I know of that has looked at community welfare. So they find that some things improve. For example, the administration improves. The use of personal equipment improves. In other words, people use their equipment better. But the income from that particular community in Accra, Brazil, did not change. And that's, again, one study using a very small sample size, I think about 50 50 communities or 50 households, or it's a very small sample size. Okay, so our study tried to address the gap and try to figure out whether or not we can say something about the FSC's impact in a biodiversity hotspot like in Indonesia. So we look at the environment. We look at environmental outcomes. So the number of forest fires, the change in forest cover, and the configuration of the forest. So how close to each other are the forest patches located, how big they are. Right. We looked at the incidence of air and water pollution, and these are binary variables, and if somebody has ideas how to improve that, I'd like to hear that. Right. And then we have socially beneficial outcomes. So we look at the incidence of poverty, which is in our case is proxied by people suffering from malnutrition. We have healthcare, whether or not new health centers got built in villages under FSC certification. Whether or not the incidence of acute respiratory infections. This is what ARI stands for. And this is a severe health problem that's rooted in people acquire acute respiratory infections when they breathe polluted air. And you can breathe polluted air because using fuel, which is very dirty fuel. Instead of people in these villages don't have electricity, so they have to use either fuel or liquid propane gas, which is more expensive but cleaner. Right? Or the other way you can get acute respiratory infections if you work in a very polluted area outside. So, right. And then it affects. So there are studies that have quantified the the severity of the disease, and it turns out that a lot of lives, a lot of work days are lost because of acute respiratory infections. So especially in Southeast Asia, air quality is a big issue, and that translates into human health. And then, yeah. Right. And then we have village level benefits. These have to do with street and village funding. So the story is that the FSC concessionaires work with the villages, and sometimes they provide village funding for these community level programs. Sometimes they provide street infrastructure like streetlights. Right. And these outcomes are based on the report and the certification reports. So these are derived from the audit reports that the Rainforest Alliance produced for FSC in Indonesia. So that's how we got them. All right, and then we don't look at the econ side. All right, so I told you about forest structure. So these are more details in terms of the environmental outcomes we consider. We use to proxy changes in forest cover. We use the MODIS data, which are geospatial data available for 250-meter resolution. This used to be the best thing that was available for free. Now there is the Hansen data, which are global and available for 30-meter resolution, both annually and cumulative until 2014, I think. So in other words, there were better data, but at that time we worked on this, there weren't. Right. And then we look at changes in the forest configuration. So I'll show you in a bit what this means. But it's important not only how much forest you're losing, but also where's the forest located. We also looked at the number of forest fires. And in this case, we considered the cumulative number of forest fires that occurred within a certain period. And the reason we decided on cumulative as opposed to difference in the fire incidence was that El Nino kicks in at different times within a year. So it's really hard to claim that it's FSC and not El Nino. In other words, the choice of year that you're considering matters a lot. So to get rid of El Nino considerations and all that, we just took the cumulative. Right, and then we use the incidence of air and water pollution, and this is a really crude indicator. It's yes, there was village pollution, village level pollution, or no, there wasn't, and it's self-reported. In other words, nobody took water samples. It's all whether people could see the water or the air were dirty or murky or whatever. In other words, it's a really crude indicator. All right, and that comes from PODIS, which is the Indonesian census that's collected every 3 years from every single village in Indonesia. And we have the village boundaries, so we can actually map the census at the village level. All right, so these are the proxies for forest quality. So I know that carbon scientists call forest quality a different thing, but we mean changes. Forest quality in this paper means changes in forest configuration. So everything in color here is some type of forest. We break down the forest into 4 different categories. Core areas, which are the green. Anything in green is core. And the core areas are good for conservation. So this is where the species live. These are the areas that you want to target. This is in contrast to edges. This is stuff in yellow, which looks like light green. But so all the light colors here, these are edges. And the issue with edges is that when you have an edge, you're more likely to see changes in the micro habitats in that area. So in other words, you're likely to have different vegetation patterns, slight changes in the microclimates, more light, lower moisture, higher predation, and different species composition, including more invasive species. So if you're looking at conservation or ecosystem service provision, it matters what kind of forest you end up with. Also, there are patches, the stuff in orange. These are tiny forest fragments that are not surrounded by other forest fragments. Right? So if you want to sustain some population here, and it may be too tiny, so it depends on how big the patch is. Right? So in other words, when we evaluate the impact of FSC certification, we want to know whether you end up with tons of little patches like these down there, or whether you end up with a lot of core areas. And that's what we try to do. Are there any questions on this? Right. So, socioeconomic outcomes. As I mentioned, our area is very dependent on firewood. So there were 2 choices: either firewood, which people collect from the forest, or liquid gas. Firewood is the dirtier fuel. Liquid gas is better. So we looked at whether or not households changed. Households' reliance on fuel changed in the years after certification. Right. We also looked at the incidence of levels of malnutrition. In other words, was there malnutrition in a village? How many people suffered from malnutrition? Right. Okay. We also looked at the incidence of acute respiratory infections. Those are linked to fuel consumption and also the quality of the air outside. In other words, number of fires. And then we looked at the village development indicators, which are changes in the village infrastructure, things like health centers, street lights, and then the availability of village funding. And all the socioeconomic data come from the census, which is collected every 3 years at village level. And I'll show you what the villages look like now. All right, so this is Kalimantan, which is the fancy word for Indonesian Borneo. Our unit of analysis is a village. So what you see here, everything, all the gray contours are village boundaries. So in other words, there's no free land in Indonesia. Everything belongs to someone. Whether people live there or not, that's a different story. So in other words, you may have a polygon that's technically a village, but all the population lives like in one corner. Right? Okay, so that's one thing to notice. Second thing to notice is that there are concessions that overlap villages. So there are 2 types of concessions. The stuff in blue are traditional logging concessions, right? And stuff in pink are the FSC certified concessions up to 2008. Okay. So we used the villages intersected by concessions as our unit of analysis. In other words, we had villages intersected by FSC concessions and then villages intersected by traditional concessions. And we tried to figure out were there differences in the village and the FSC villages relative to villages that look exactly the same but were under traditional concessions? That's the question we explore in this paper. Right. Okay, so technically there is selective logging. In other words, these forests in Indonesia are dipterocarpal forests. They're very diverse. Not every species has commercial value. So the way logging usually happens is loggers take certain trees and leave others, but sometimes in order to get to the valuable species, you cut down trees. The other source of deforestation is local communities. So sometimes traditional logging concessions are either not used, or sometimes there are conflicts with local communities, so that local communities develop land that's technically within the logging concession, right? And as a result, there were about 1.8 million hectares of forest loss between year 2000 and year 2010, right? And a lot of the degraded land gets converted afterwards to oil palms. And there was some evidence that there was a lot of forest degradation happening because of unsustainable logging practices. Alright, so in other words, logging causes environmental problems, so traditional logging concessions may not be the best thing. So, right, these are the FSC concessions that got certified in that time period. So since then, there have been way more, but up to 2008, there were only 4. And they vary in terms of what they produced, plywood versus roundwood, and they also vary in terms of the ownership. Some include villages in the firm that forms the concession. Sometimes they're just purely commercially owned. Right. So this is the design of the study. So year 2000 is what we call our baseline. So these are the years before anybody has started thinking about certifying. Most of them applied for, most of the companies applied for certification somewhere here. Some started applying as early as 2002, and others right before the year 2006. So for this paper, we just ignore the temporal impacts and look at before and after certification. And the end year for this study is 2008. And the reason we decided in 2008 is because we didn't have, at the time, later census data were not available. Now we have better data. So. Okay. So we use villages in traditional and FSC concessions as our unit of analysis. There were 76 villages that are treated or under the intervention, and there were and about 1,100 villages that were within traditional concessions. This is what I call our control villages. They were not intersected by an FSC concession. So the idea is that we use statistical methods that would allow us to say what would have happened in an FSC concession or concession village had it not been certified. And to do this, we use key characteristics, observable characteristics, stuff like socioeconomic characteristics of the village, poverty levels, population, how far away it is from markets, or different proxies for markets. Also what it looks like, how far it is from a river, and rivers are how you transport timber illegally. So if you have more timber, you're more likely to have more illegal harvesting. Yes, so more. Also, higher slopes and elevation. In other words, the land is not good for anything else. If you're on high slope and high elevation. If you have peat areas are technically protected. And then we look at years 2000, 2006, 2008, and 2010 for these deforestation data. All right, so what we're trying to do here is isolate the causal impact of FSC. So in other words, design the study in a way that allows us to rule out alternative explanations. And that's what these quasi-experimental research designs attempt to do. So the traditional designs include stuff like looking at certification before and after. So in other words, look at the village before, some years before it got certified, and some years after it got certified. Well, the issue with this is that you can't really say it's FSC driving the result, right? Sometimes you can have prices rising. So in other words, you observe deforestation after certification. And the reason is not because certification is not working, it's because the timber prices have increased in the meantime, driving more wood production. But unless you, so in other words, you need designs that control for prices, right? In order to say what the impact of FSC was, right? Then you have the inside-outside comparisons. In other words, looking at what happens is to villages inside the concession to villages that are outside the concession. Well, there's 2 possible issues with that. One of them is that you just displaced deforestation from the FSC concession to the nearby village, right? Or the second story is they're not really the same. So one village is really high up in the mountains, they're really close to each other, but they look completely different. So one has really crappy timber, the other one has great timber. So if you just do these inside-outside comparisons without controlling for location or the threat of deforestation, then you can't really say it's FSC or another policy. So a solution to that are for large-scale analysis or things that we call quasi-experimental research designs. And a lot of things can go wrong with those, but they at least help us start thinking about how do we isolate the impact of a policy, and that we're talking about the causal impact as opposed to some correlation, right? So there were different. In this paper, we used a combination of first 2. We used a combination of matching and triple differences, actually. They have their own issues, and the literature has pointed those out. But so far, nobody has come up with better methods. Right. So this is a mouthful, right? We use Mahalanobis matching with trimming based on propensity score. What this does is, in essence, we're just using observable characteristics to construct what would have happened to an FSC village had it not been certified. And what Mahalanobis matching means is that it's a weighting, a Mahalanobis distance, it's a different weighting strategy. In other words, we give more weight to covariates or characteristics that are less noisy, and smaller weights on characteristics that are noisy, right? So this is what Mahalanobis matching means. And then trimming propensity score is just accounting for the probability of a village being put under FSC certification, right? So we want to make sure that the villages, it helps us get better matches. In other words, get better statistical, more robust statistical procedure. And then we do post-matching bias and variance adjustments. This is just a fancy way of saying we do regression methods to refine the estimates. Right? And I'll show you what matching does. How many people have done any matching or know what matching is? Okay, 3 people. Oh, 4. All right, so the idea is that you have, I'm using a very simplified example, different dots. So the dots differ in color, shape, and size, right? Let's say the P stands for a policy. So some of the dots got affected by this policy, and we'd like to quantify the impact of the policy on deforestation and this outcome. So if I told you that the blue point that was protected lost 5 hectares, the idea is that matching to find a dot that looks exactly the same but was not protected. So in this case, we use statistical approaches to get the protected dot matched to the unprotected dot that looked exactly the same. So we find that when we do that, we find that the difference is 5 hectares, or 10 hectares, right? So this one lost 5 hectares, this lost 15 hectares, right? And we do this for every single dot that's protected. So in other words, then we'll compare this dot to this dot, and then the difference is again 10 hectares. And then there are some dots that don't have any close matches. So this is green, and there's nothing that looks quite like it. So the statistical procedure just drops it, right? So on average, we can claim that this program reduce deforestation by 10 hectares on average. Right? So this is all that matching does. This fancy way of just answering this question of what would have happened if a village or a dot was not protected or put under FSC. Right, and then we use triple difference estimators. What it does, I'm not going to go into the details, but this pretty much says, so this is how we construct the outcomes. So it's a bunch of taken differences. And what this does is controlling for different trends. So in other words, we want to make sure that the rate of change between the certified and non-certified concessions were the same. We match the trends before certification, and we want to see whether or not certified villages changed faster post-certification than the villages that looked exactly the same but were under traditional concessions. Okay, so we're talking about rates of change. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to go into this, but this is like there were a lot of equations. Pretty much this is how we constructed the outcome. So we take the differences between, so blue is the treated. Treated means FSC villages, and then control are the traditional villages. Right? So so difference before, difference after, difference before, difference after, and we compare those. So the way it's to interpret this is if you see a positive value with the outcome like forest cover, then FSC worked. So in other words, forest cover increased faster in FSC villages than it did in observationally similar traditional villages. Okay, and then if it's a negative sign, it means it just decreased. For some outcomes, we want this to be positive, right? Forest cover, we want to have a positive sign, and for disease incidence, we want to see a negative sign. Okay, so was FSC certification effective in those years in Kalimantan? Well, first we have to start thinking about where are the FSC villages. And it turns out that they're not randomly placed. In other words, they're specifically targeting locations that are far away from markets, far away from rivers, have few people, and the people there are poor. Right? So in other words, this is support that we need to use these quasi-experimental research designs because FSC is not randomly placed Okay, so this is the result. We find that FSC worked. It increased forest cover by 5 percentage points, and by percentage points, I mean it's a reference to the way the outcome is measured. So we look at our outcome is the percent forest cover within a village. So we find that the percent forest cover within villages increased by 5. Okay, in the FSC villages. We also find that the area, the perforated area, in other words, openings, small openings in core forests, those also increased. So this, our interpretation is that this is evidence of selective logging. So you're still increasing forest cover, but you're introducing these small openings in the canopy. And then we found that the incidence of air pollution went down by like 31%, which is, it's a binary variable, so it has issues, but at least there is some evidence that it got reduced. Right. And then in terms of socioeconomic outcomes, FSC also worked. It reduced viral dependence, the incidence of acute respiratory infections. It increased public funding and decreased the number of people who suffered from malnutrition. In other words, it had some desirable outcomes. All right, so in other words, there's some evidence that FSC worked. Increased forest cover, introduced selective logging practices. It didn't have any impact on the number of fires or the impact on core areas. And impact on water quality. So these binary indicators, was there water pollution in your village or wasn't there, were not statistically significant. We found a lot of social benefits. Reduction in fluids, reduction in acute respiratory infections, reduction in malnutrition, and increase in village level funding. We didn't see any changes in integrated health centers, and one explanation is that these things take time to build, right? So now with the longer data, we can actually look at those. Okay, so conclusions. FSC seems to work, right? So there are a lot of unknowns. So we use these crude geospatial data to proxy for forest health. We don't really know what's happening to forest composition or to the biodiversity within the forest. So some people have found evidence that you may get impacts in terms of differences in mammal species or richness or abundance. So we don't really know whether FSC is doing something in terms of providing ecosystem services. We know that it provides some carbon benefits by increasing forest cover rate, but we don't really know what it means for other ecosystem services that may be crucial for the area. So pollination would be one. The other thing that comes up is that we need more evidence in order to start thinking about the mechanisms through which FSC is affecting change on the ground. Right. So how do we improve the performance of FSC or other sustainability policies? And I'm just going to overview some possible extensions that we have been exploring in other contexts, but the results or the implications hold here as well. So one of them is FSC has different impacts in space, right? So what this is showing is the causal impact of in this case is protected areas, but it could be FSC. So it would be interesting to see where FSC is effective. Is it close to roads and close to the concession boundaries? Or is it somewhere in the middle, right? And also where FSC isn't effective. Maybe it's far away on the high slopes, it doesn't really do much. Okay, so looking at the heterogeneity would also help us start thinking about what are the specific practices that FSC is encouraging so that we can link those to environmental outcomes or social outcomes. All right. So what's the scale at which we should be planning for FSC certification? So right now, FSC certification is done at the concession scale. In other words, is this the right scale if we're considering landscape level effects and population by dynamics or whatever? So this is a study, this is Brazil, and this is sugarcane production. And it compares two types of landscapes. One of them is the landscape you get when you plant at a farm-by-farm basis for sugarcane. The other one is when you plant at the landscape level, and landscape meaning this watershed. This is a watershed. Looks like a hand or something. But so we find that using models, economic and biodiversity models, and water quality models, we find that if you plant at a large scale, you get benefits in terms of reduced costs of compliance. In other words, this landscape is cheaper to get than this landscape. and you get more species because you get this connectivity of patches, right? You get more connected patches as opposed to tiny things that are full of edges and may not be able to support a large number of species. Oh, I should have told you, green is natural forest, yellow is sugarcane. Bottom line is, you end up with different benefits if you distribute the forest differently. So, yeah. So this is what I wanted to say with this slide. You don't have to read like all of the text that's out there. All right. So we need to start thinking about one way to incentivize one way to incentivize more FSC or better practices is to help companies offset their cost. And one way to offset the cost is to link FSC certification to payments for ecosystem services. The question is, how do we quantify the ecosystem services that arise from FSC certification? So there is a lot of work that needs to happen to start in terms of understanding carbon storage benefits, stuff like water quality benefits, biodiversity benefits, and poverty. So to start and try to link FSC certification to different payments for ecosystem services that should target the areas that actually provide ecosystem services. This is the same landscape. And this is, the other thing that I wanted to say is that ecosystem services is anthropocentric concept, right? It depends on where people are. So we need to figure out the spatial patterns. There is a strong spatial dependence between where people are and the value of the services that make it to them. So carbon is an easy one. The value of carbon it's a global public good. In other words, everybody benefits from climate change mitigation. Whereas water quality is a local good. So sometimes it's easier to incentivize people on the ground who bear the cost of instituting these practices by showing that there are local benefits as well. And water quality is a great example because everybody cares about their water quality. Right? There are no other substitutes. So, and then it's really challenging to model water quality benefits. So this is something that hopefully somebody will figure out how to do. And then finally, these are production possibilities frontiers in different contexts. So what these frontiers tell you is what are the trade-offs between different outcomes. And you can ignore the different lines you can ignore the different white lines for now. But what's the take-home message for this is that FSC certification is likely to get us somewhere here. Research in Brazil shows us that certain policies like FSC do something, but it's not socially optimal. In other words, we end up being somewhere here where we want to be somewhere at this frontier. It just gives you the best way you can allocate your resources to get the best outcomes for. But this is number of species and agricultural profit. Okay. So there is a lot of work, and I've seen one example where people have started thinking about additionality, sort of showing that FSC by itself is not enough, and trying to link this to a point on the frontier using red money. So they got red money to get to this frontier point, right? And this is one concession in Peru. All right, I think that was it.
Before we take questions, I just want to mention, I forgot at the beginning to say that we're going to go over to the bear stand afterwards. Anybody who wants to go over for a more informal conversation, come on over after the talk. Questions for Daniela? So I have the first one. Can you say more about the auditing process for certification and the extent to which that's either a strength or a challenge? In other words, at least in the States, the auditors get paid by the companies. And you can imagine that maybe the kind of work you're doing would be viewed as questioning. They could get certified, but maybe your data are suggesting that it's not working as well as the auditing report suggests.
Well,
what do you think is the best way to make that a productive partnership that still subjects this kind of work to kind of good research scrutiny?
Well, so in Indonesia, the auditing is done by third parties, so there is no conflict of interest. In other words, they're not paid by the companies themselves.
Oh, they are.
They aren't.
Oh,
So it's the
fascinating.
Rainforest Alliance or some other, it's a third-party auditors who go in the field and check for whether the concession meets all the criteria. So there's the conflict of interest that I'll be slightly concerned about. So there isn't in this case. So the auditing reports have been very helpful in trying to in terms of understanding what's happening on the ground. But we have auditing reports for only concessions that got certified. So in other words, we don't really know what the parallel trends are for the concessions that didn't get certified.
Yeah.
And one concern that that has been pointed out is that sometimes firms own more than one concession plot. So if one concession plot gets certified, and we see improvement practices there, but then that company has another plot, is it possible that it just displays their bad practices to the next plot? We don't know. This is an open question. But with the issue with the reports is that they're super helpful in understanding the context, but they're not really telling us anything about the uncertified plots. So if we can get those kind of data, that would be perfect.
Do you think the results would have been the same if your certified areas had been randomly distributed? For example, if they were closer to ports, that were closer to rivers and access points, would you have seen the positive benefit? Do you think?
I don't know. So this kind of question requires a mechanisms for change, right? In other words, right now this is a reduced form estimation in the sense that we don't really have a mechanism through which we know or we hypothesize changes are happening. So in the future, it's really interesting to take these results and start thinking about what mechanisms can be used to explain the patterns we're seeing. And then if we have a mechanism, I'm an economist, so I think about models. We can change the distance to ports and see what changes that change in distance to ports is actually making through the system. So, but yeah, it's a really good point about mechanisms, and this is reduced form. In other words, we have guesses, but that's it. We're not testing them right now.
So you were at Nature Conservancy. You share your research with leaders there. What do they think and how do they plan to use it?
So it depends on the leaders. So part of the frontier stuff that I showed you was DAO. Actually, it was a partnership between DAO and TNC. And TNC was engaged to help DAO plan better for sugarcane production. So there was interest in terms of DAO has been, I don't know whether they're going to do it because they're merging with another company or whatever. But at the time, they really needed guidance to help from us to help them plan better for sugarcane in a way that meets their production goals, also complies with the local legislation. And what we found is that there were incentives for DAO, if DAO were to institute this kind of planning, the landscape level planning that I showed a little bit ago. There'll be incentives in the form of cost savings. So if they plan at a larger scale, they're likely to get reductions in the cost of compliance and cost of production. Whether they can actually do this on the ground is a different story because it means that you have to contact different landowners and figure out how to coordinate among these landowners. But Dell was definitely interested in using our results. I'm currently working on FSC and improved forest management practices in Mexico and Indonesia. So we're continuing this work using better data. Also, we're looking at heterogeneity. So in Mexico, we're looking at the role of property rights, private property versus ejidos, and also factors within ejidos that can prevent deforestation. So there are a lot of partners on the ground that are very interested in trying to figure out what our results are and how they can modify, especially ejido behavior, to prevent deforestation in a place like the Yucatan Peninsula. Whether things will happen is a different story, but at least people are interested.
So how do you think data generated by surveys and just warm perceptions could help you understand what's happening on the social side?
So that's a good point. So in different example, I also work in Uganda and we have households. So it's a different context. Households collecting fuelwood from a forest patch. And households have an option. They can either buy the fuelwood if they're close to a market. They can sell the fuelwood. They go collect it and then sell it in the market. Or they just use it for their own domestic use. Right? So what we find there is that location matters. If you're close to a forest patch but away from markets, then you're going to be self-sufficient. If you're really close to markets or away from forests, you're going to buy the fuel. And if you're in between forest and markets, you're going to go collect it and sell it on the market. But if you introduce a policy, in other words, you wipe out one patch, either protect it or you degrade it so badly that there is no forest anymore, you would assume that households go to the neighbor's patch, whereas our model says that some households will switch to being buyers, and then you're likely to see the impact of that policy, not immediately in the buffer of the protected area or the nearest patch, but maybe somewhere down the road, or somewhere in the next village, for example, where the suppliers are coming from. So this is why it's important, and you can't get to this kind of, this is a mechanism, right? We have a theory, and we collected survey data to test this prediction. And then from there, we're trying to figure out, do some simulations, change forest cover, and see how the patterns change. You can't really do this with census data. You need survey data. You need to understand how households are changing. So that's why, yes, it's really important. Like survey data, you can tailor your questions to exactly what you want to do. And yeah.
So I'm not sure I understood at the beginning of the talk. You were saying, here's some of the other studies that have been done. I've read some of your work that sort of says that mostly they haven't been able to do the kind of controlled analyses you're talking about, but it looked like some of the guesstimates, if you will, of benefits were really small.
You mean here?
Fractions of 1%. Did I read that right?
Yeah, so this
go back one more, please.
Oh yeah, these are not guesstimates. These are actually most of these are quasi. So this is work in progress. They use these rigorous impact evaluations to get the causal impact.
Okay.
But there are only a few studies, and some of them, yeah, and this is the annual reduction in deforestation. So it's like 0.02%. Right?
So, do you have a sense? On the other hand, some of the results you got were quite a bit larger, just absolute
Yeah. So
benefits.
our results were percent. They were not annualized. So these are annualized, and when we annualize them, we get between 1% and 3%.
Oh, okay.
So much larger still. And I think what's going on is that in Indonesia, you have a lot of NGOs. So, and there were things like the Tropical Timber Foundation that helps companies with the technical requirements before you certify. There was also WWF and TNC who are very active, who monitor whether or not concessions lose their certification or not. Monitor what concessionaires do. And sometimes, I'm not going to say who, but because of an NGO, one concessionaire lost their certificate for a few years because they were not following the prescriptions of the FSC certificate. In other words, in Kalimantan, we have a lot of NGOs, whereas in other locations, I'm not quite sure this is the case. So maybe NGO involvement is a driving factor. And this is a question that we're trying to start looking into. So we're about to launch this pan-tropical study where I'm hoping people will allow us to use their data to start looking at, can we detect patterns across tropical countries in terms of where is FSC working, both in the country, across countries and within countries. So this is hopefully something that we'll be able to do soon. But as of now, these are rigorous studies, and some of them find no effect, or sometimes find there is a very small effect.